I always believed my mother was protecting my future, especially the trust fund my father left for me. But as my 21st birthday got closer, I discovered a shocking secret. She wasn't protecting it. She was planning to take it away from me. Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real people, events, or situations is purely coincidental. I grew up believing that my future was already decided long before I understood what money or inheritance even meant. My father had passed away when I was very young, and the only thing he left behind for me was a trust fund that everyone in the family talked about in a very careful, controlled way. It was never described as something I owned. Instead, it was always presented as something I would receive later, like a distant reward I had to earn by simply waiting. My mother made sure I never forgot that rule. Every time I asked about it, she would give me the same calm but firm response. "It is not yours yet. You are not ready." At first I accepted it because I trusted her completely. She was the only parent I had left, and I believed everything she did was for my protection. She managed all the legal and financial matters connected to the trust fund. I never saw statements, never saw account balances, and never even saw the original documents my father had supposedly signed. Whenever I tried to ask for details, she would change the topic quickly, or tell me that money like that could ruin a young person's life if handled too early. She said it was invested carefully and growing in value, and that one day when I turned 21, it would be handed over to me in full. But over time, small things started to feel strange. I noticed she became unusually protective whenever the topic came up. Even mentioning the word trust fund in passing would make her tense for a moment before she smiled and redirected the conversation. She often said things like, "We are doing what is best for you," or "You will understand when you are older." But those words started to feel less reassuring and more like barriers placed between me and the truth. By the time I reached my late teens, I started becoming more aware of how dependent I was on her version of reality. I had no independent access to anything related to my inheritance. Even basic questions like which bank it was held in were answered vaguely. She would say things like, "It is managed by professionals," or "It is safe, don't worry about it," but never gave specifics. I began to notice that whenever financial advisors or lawyers were mentioned, she handled everything privately, without allowing me to be part of any discussion. The first real crack in her control happened completely by accident. One evening, I came home earlier than usual. The house was quiet, except for her voice coming from the kitchen. She was on speakerphone, speaking in a tone I had never heard before. Louder, sharper, and far more serious. I stopped walking when I heard my name. She said, "We just need one more year. After that, it all transfers back to me." There was a pause on the other end of the call, and then she continued, "Once he turns 21, we won't have time to fix it. I need access before that happens." My heart started beating faster, but I didn't move. I stayed completely still, trying to understand what I had just heard. The trust fund was supposed to transfer to me at 21, not back to her. That sentence didn't fit anything I'd been told my entire life. It felt like someone had taken the ground away beneath me without warning. I quietly stepped back and left the area before she could notice me. I went to my room and closed the door, but I couldn't focus on anything else after that. Every memory I had suddenly started to look different. Every conversation about waiting and protecting my future now felt like it had another meaning hidden behind it. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying her words again and again in my mind. "It all transfers back to me." The phrase didn't make sense unless there was something I had never been told. I started thinking about every time she had refused to show me documents, every time she had dismissed my questions, every time she had insisted that I didn't need to worry about it. For the first time, I felt something I had never felt toward her before. Not anger, not confusion, but suspicion. A slow, uncomfortable doubt began forming, as if a story I had believed my entire life was quietly breaking apart without anyone else noticing. I realized that whatever was happening with the trust fund was not as simple as I had been told, and that my 21st birthday might not be the ending I had always expected. After hearing that phone call, I could no longer pretend that everything was normal. Something had shifted inside me. and I started looking at every detail of my life with suspicion. My mother still acted the same in front of me. Calm, organized, always in control, but now I noticed things I had ignored before. She was careful about documents, overly protective of her laptop, and strangely defensive whenever I entered her home office. It felt like she had built a system around the trust fund that I was never meant to understand. That night marked the beginning of my search for the truth, even though I didn't fully know what I was looking for yet. I started small, going through anything I could access without raising suspicion. Old folders, random files in shared storage, even papers that seemed unimportant. I told myself I was just curious, but deep down I knew I was trying to uncover something hidden. Most of what I found at first looked normal tax documents, insurance papers, and legal forms connected to my father's estate. But as I examined them more closely, I noticed inconsistencies. Some account numbers appeared in different formats, some names were slightly altered, and some documents looked like they had been reprinted or edited at different times. It didn't prove anything yet, but it was enough to make me continue. The real breakthrough came when I accessed an old backup drive that had been left in a storage drawer. It contained scanned copies of financial records that were not part of the current system my mother used. As I went through them, I noticed that the original trust structure had been more straightforward than what I had been told. The fund was supposed to be held in a single managed account, with strict legal protection until my 21st birthday. However, the newer records showed multiple transfers into different entities, some of which I had never heard of before. What made it worse was that some of these entities were linked to names that seemed familiar, especially my mother's new husband. At first, I tried to convince myself there was an innocent explanation. Maybe it was part of restructuring, maybe it was legal optimization, or maybe I just didn't understand financial systems well enough. But the deeper I went, the harder it became to ignore the pattern. The money wasn't just being managed, it was being moved. Slowly, carefully, and in ways that were designed to avoid attention. I began taking screenshots and saving copies of everything, not knowing yet what I would do with them, but feeling instinctively that I needed proof. As I continued digging, I found something that completely changed my perspective. One of the documents showed a change in beneficiary-related instructions that I did not recognize. My name was still there, but the conditions attached to it had been altered. The wording suggested that access to the trust could be restricted based on vague criteria like financial responsibility and family stability. These terms were not part of the original agreement my father had established, at least not according to the older records I had seen. It looked like someone had tried to build legal flexibility into something that was supposed to be fixed and protected. That discovery made me realize this was not just about secrecy anymore. It was about control. Someone had the ability to influence how and when I could access what was supposed to be mine. And the timing of it suddenly made sense with what I had overheard on the phone. My mother's urgency wasn't random. It was connected to a deadline, my 21st birthday. Everything seemed to revolve around that date, as if it was a final point where control would either be lost or permanently secured. I spent hours cross-checking names and transaction histories, trying to understand the structure behind everything. The more I looked, the more complicated it became. There were layers of financial movement that suggested coordination, not accident. Some transfers were routed through legal intermediaries, others through private accounts that were difficult to trace directly. It wasn't chaotic, it was organized, which made it even more disturbing. At this point, I knew I couldn't rely on my own understanding alone. I needed someone who could interpret what I was seeing. That's when I made the decision to contact a financial lawyer, but I didn't want to expose myself directly. Instead, I gathered all the evidence I had found, organized it carefully, and sent it anonymously, under the pretense that it came from a concerned relative trying to understand suspicious activity in an estate. I didn't expect a response, but within a couple of days, I received a call. The lawyer sounded serious from the beginning. He asked specific questions about the structure of the trust and the documents I had provided. I kept my identity hidden, answering carefully, pretending I was only relaying information. But as he reviewed the files, his tone changed. He stopped treating it like a simple inquiry and started speaking like someone who had found a real legal issue. He told me that some of the transfers I had flagged were highly unusual for a protected trust fund. He also mentioned that certain modifications in the documents could indicate improper influence or unauthorized restructuring. Hearing that from a professional confirmed what I had been afraid to accept on my own. This was not just confusion or misunderstanding. Something had been deliberately altered. After the call ended, I sat alone for a long time, staring at everything I had collected. I felt a mix of fear and clarity. Fear, because I didn't know how deep this went, and clarity because I now understood that the trust fund I had grown up believing in was not as secure or untouched as I had been told. My mother was not just managing my future. She was involved in shaping it in ways I had never been allowed to see. After speaking with the lawyer, I couldn't go back to seeing things the same way again. Everything I had discovered so far pointed to one uncomfortable truth. My mother wasn't just managing the trust fund, she was actively reshaping it. But what I still didn't understand was the full purpose behind it. Why would she risk legal consequences? Why would she alter something that was meant to secure my future? I needed clarity, and more importantly, I needed proof that could stand beyond suspicion. The lawyer contacted me again a few days later. This time, his tone was more direct. He confirmed that after a preliminary review, the patterns in the documents suggested coordinated financial restructuring that didn't align with standard trust fund protection laws. He explained that while some movement of assets can be legal, the way these transfers were timed and distributed raised serious questions. He advised further investigation, but warned that whoever controlled the trust likely had access to legal advisors who knew how to stay within technical boundaries while still manipulating outcomes. That statement made everything feel more serious. It was no longer just a family secret. It was potentially a planned strategy. I started focusing on one key detail that kept appearing across multiple records: the involvement of my mother's new husband. His name was linked to several intermediary accounts, some of which were used in transactions related to the trust. At first, I didn't want to believe it. It felt too direct, too personal. But as I connected more dots, it became harder to ignore. These weren't random associations. There was a consistent pattern of financial movement that suggested coordination between my mother and him. I began to understand the possible structure of the plan piece by piece. If the trust fund had conditions tied to my age, then controlling it before I turned 21 would be critical. That explained the urgency I had overheard on the phone. The phrase, "one more year," was not casual, it was strategic. It meant there was a limited window of opportunity before full legal ownership would transfer to me automatically. Once that happened, any influence over the fund would disappear. What shocked me most was realizing how carefully everything had been prepared. It wasn't something that had started recently. Some of the financial adjustments dated back years, slowly shaping the trust into something more flexible than it originally was. It looked like a long-term effort to gain indirect control without triggering immediate suspicion. The more I studied it, the more it felt like I was looking at a system designed to appear legitimate on the surface while serving a hidden purpose underneath. One evening, I decided to re-examine the original trust agreement as carefully as possible. I compared it with the newer versions I had found. That's when I noticed something subtle but critical. Certain clauses had been rewritten in ways that changed their interpretation. The original language was strict and protective, clearly designed to safeguard the inheritance until I reached adulthood. But the updated versions included vague conditions that could be interpreted differently depending on who was managing them. It created room for control, and that control seemed to rest entirely in the hands of whoever was acting as the trustee. That realization made everything fall into place in a disturbing way. My mother wasn't just delaying access. She was building a framework where she could potentially retain influence even after I turned 21. The trust wasn't being destroyed. It was being reshaped into something flexible enough to be redirected. I shared all of this with the lawyer through encrypted communication, still keeping my identity hidden. His response was immediate and more serious than before. He said that if what I was describing was accurate, then it could represent a breach of fiduciary duty by the trustee or anyone acting in their place. He also suggested that legal intervention would be necessary, but warned that whoever was involved would likely try to act quickly if they suspected investigation. That warning changed my approach completely. I realized I couldn't just observe anymore. I had to assume that any delay could allow further changes to the fund. So I began collecting everything more systematically, organizing documents, verifying timelines, and mapping connections between accounts. I treated it like building a case, even though I was still doing it alone. During this process, one detail kept repeating that I couldn't ignore. Almost every major financial shift aligned with personal events in my life. My education milestones, my birthdays, and particularly the period approaching my 21st year. It felt intentional, as if the financial structure had been designed around my age rather than around standard investment logic. That realization added a deeply personal layer to everything. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about timing and control over my transition into adulthood. The more I understood, the more I began to see a clearer picture of intent. My mother's actions were not random or reactive. They were precise, calculated, and tied to a deadline I was approaching, whether I was ready or not. And at the center of it all was a plan that seemed designed to shift control of the trust before I could legally claim it for myself. After weeks of gathering documents and speaking carefully with the lawyer, I realized something important. I couldn't win this by just watching from the shadows anymore. Every new piece of information pointed toward a coordinated plan that was already in motion. If I waited too long, the trust could be fully reshaped before I even had a chance to legally challenge it. That thought forced me to stop being passive and start thinking strategically. For the first time, I wasn't just trying to understand what was happening, I was preparing to respond to it. The lawyer became more direct in his guidance. He told me that the situation had reached a stage where timing was critical. If the trustee could be contacted and verified, it would strengthen my position significantly. But there was a risk. If my mother or anyone involved in managing the trust discovered that I was investigating, they could accelerate their actions or attempt to justify the changes legally before I could intervene. That meant I had to move carefully but decisively. The first major step I took was reaching out to the original trustee of my father's estate. He was not someone I had spoken to in years, and I only had limited contact information. I hesitated before making the call, unsure how he would react or whether he would even remember me. When I finally reached him, I introduced myself cautiously, not revealing everything at once. At first, he sounded distant, as if the matter was long behind him. But as I mentioned my father's name and the trust fund, his tone changed. He asked me to send whatever information I had, so I compiled a selection of the most important documents and forwarded them through secure channels. I didn't explain everything, but I gave him enough to understand that something was wrong. Then I waited. The response came faster than I expected. When he reviewed the materials, he immediately recognized inconsistencies. He confirmed that the original trust agreement had been designed with strict protection measures. According to him, the structure was meant to ensure that no external party, including family members, could redirect or access the funds before I reached the specified age. Hearing that directly from the person responsible for setting it up gave me something I had been missing: certainty. But what came next was even more important. He told me that some of the modifications I had found were not authorized by him or by any official amendment process he had been involved in. That meant the changes were either improperly executed or made without proper legal oversight. He didn't use dramatic language, but the seriousness in his tone was unmistakable. He agreed to help me formally if necessary, but warned that any official action would likely escalate tensions quickly. With that confirmation, I knew I had to move beyond investigation and into preparation. The lawyer and I began coordinating a legal strategy that focused on preserving the current state of the trust before any further changes could be made. One of the first actions we took was requesting a temporary freeze on any suspicious transactions related to the accounts tied to the fund. It wasn't a full legal shutdown, but it was enough to slow down any ongoing transfers while the investigation continued. At the same time, I started gathering everything into a structured record. Every email, every scanned document, every account reference was organized chronologically. I wasn't just collecting evidence anymore. I was building a timeline that showed how the trust had changed over time. The goal was to make the pattern undeniable, so that even outside observers could see the progression clearly. While this was happening, I began noticing subtle changes in my mother's behavior. She was still calm on the surface, but she started becoming more cautious. She spent more time on private calls and often left the house unexpectedly. There were moments when she would look at me for longer than usual, as if trying to determine whether I knew something. But she never asked directly, and I never revealed anything. One evening, I overheard her speaking in a lower tone than usual again, this time discussing paperwork and deadlines. I couldn't hear everything clearly, but I caught fragments that confirmed my fears. She was discussing final submissions, approvals, and timing related to before transfer conditions. It sounded like she was trying to complete something before a fixed deadline, which I already knew was my 21st birthday. That moment made everything feel urgent again. I realized we were no longer in a slow build-up phase. We were in the final stage of whatever plan had been set in motion. The freeze request helped, but it wasn't a permanent solution. It only held things in place temporarily. The trustee's involvement changed the dynamic completely. With his confirmation, we now had a direct link back to the original intent of the trust. The lawyer explained that this would be crucial if we needed to challenge any unauthorized modifications in court. But he also warned that legal processes take time, and time was the one thing we were running out of. So we refined the plan further. The trustee agreed to formally reassert the original terms of the trust, while the lawyer prepared documentation to challenge any conflicting versions. Meanwhile, I was instructed to avoid confrontation at home and maintain normal behavior, so as not to alert anyone involved. It was a strange position to be in, living normally on the surface while everything underneath was shifting rapidly. Every day felt like a balance between patience and urgency. I knew that one wrong move could expose everything too early. But doing nothing could allow the plan to complete itself before I had any legal protection. As the pieces came together, one fact became impossible to ignore. My mother wasn't acting alone in ignorance or confusion. She was working within a system that had been carefully constructed over time, and now that system was approaching its final stage. The only thing left unclear was whether she believed she could still control the outcome or whether she was already preparing for what would happen next. In the days leading up to the final confrontation, everything felt strangely calm on the surface. But underneath that calm was a tension that kept building every hour. I had done everything I could to slow things down legally, but I knew that whoever was controlling the trust would not simply stop trying. The freeze on transactions had created a barrier, not a solution. It was only a matter of time before a final attempt would be made to regain control. I could sense it in the way my mother behaved. Quiet, focused, and increasingly distant, as if she was working through a problem in her mind that she refused to share with anyone. She started spending more time away from home, often leaving early in the morning and returning late at night. When she was home, she was unusually composed, almost rehearsed in her behavior. There were no emotional reactions, no unnecessary conversations, just a controlled presence that made it harder to read her intentions. But I had already stopped relying on appearances. I was watching patterns now, not expressions. The lawyer had warned me that a final move was likely. If the people involved believed they were close to losing control permanently, they would attempt one last legal push to secure authority before everything was locked down completely. That meant they might try to present documents directly to the bank or trustees, hoping to override or bypass the restrictions already in place. I didn't know exactly when it would happen, but I knew it would be soon. That day came unexpectedly. I remember waking up to a missed call from the lawyer, followed by a short message telling me to stay alert. No explanation, just urgency. I didn't need details to understand what that meant. Something had started. By late morning, I learned that my mother had gone to the bank handling the trust fund. She was not alone. She had brought documents, new authorization forms, and what she claimed was updated legal approval for changes in the trust structure. Her goal was clear: to regain full authority before any further restrictions could interfere. At the bank, she presented herself with confidence. She explained that there had been administrative updates and that she needed to finalize urgent adjustments tied to the trust. On paper, it looked organized. The documents were professionally prepared, and at first glance they appeared legitimate enough to cause hesitation rather than immediate rejection. But what she didn't know was that the freeze order had already been registered and flagged internally. The bank staff didn't immediately approve or deny her request. Instead, they escalated the matter to their legal compliance department, which triggered an automatic review of all related accounts. That delay was critical. It bought time for the trustee and the lawyer to respond before anything irreversible could happen. When the lawyer called me, his voice was steady but firm. He told me that my mother had attempted a direct intervention, but it had been intercepted. The documents she submitted were now under review, and because of the earlier freeze and trustee confirmation, they were unlikely to be accepted without further legal scrutiny. But he also made it clear that this was not the end of it. It was the beginning of the final escalation. Later that afternoon, I was told that she had been temporarily questioned by bank compliance officers. They didn't accuse her of anything outright, but they requested clarification regarding the origin of the documents she submitted. According to what I was told later, her explanations became increasingly defensive as the conversation continued. The more she tried to justify the changes, the more inconsistencies appeared in her statements. At the same time, the trustee formally submitted a declaration confirming the original structure of the trust fund. This document directly contradicted the modifications she had attempted to enforce. It was a critical turning point, because it re-established legal authority over the fund's original terms. From that moment, any unauthorized changes would require strong legal justification to be considered valid. When my mother left the bank that day, she did not leave with control over the situation. Instead, she left with uncertainty. The system she had relied on was no longer responding the way she expected. Every action she had taken was now being reviewed, cross-checked, and challenged from multiple sides. Back at home, I noticed a shift in her behavior almost immediately. The calm presence she had maintained for days was gone. Instead, there was tension, subtle but visible. She avoided direct conversations and spent long periods in her room. The sense of control she usually carried seemed to be weakening, replaced by something less predictable. That evening, I overheard fragments of a phone conversation that confirmed everything. She was speaking urgently, asking about legal options, deadlines, and possible ways to correct the situation before final transfer conditions activate. It was clear she was trying to recover control, but the language she used suggested desperation rather than strategy. The next morning, the lawyer informed me that her attempt had officially failed at the bank level. The documents she submitted were rejected pending investigation, and the freeze remained active. The trustee's statement had been accepted as the verified reference point for the trust structure. In simple terms, her plan had collapsed at the final stage. What followed was not dramatic in the way I expected. There was no confrontation at home, no immediate explanation. Instead, there was silence. She stopped discussing the trust altogether. It was as if acknowledging it would make the situation more real than she was willing to accept. But I understood what had happened. For years, she had maintained influence over something she believed she could eventually fully control. Now that possibility had been taken away. The structure she had tried to reshape no longer responded to her authority. The system had shifted, and for the first time, she was no longer the one guiding it. The morning of my 21st birthday didn't feel like the celebration I had imagined growing up. There were no decorations waiting for me, no family excitement, no sense of closure that people usually associate with turning an important age. Instead, there was a quiet tension in the house, like everyone knew something had already changed even before anything was officially announced. My mother was awake earlier than usual, but she didn't speak much. She moved through the house in a controlled, distant way, as if trying to avoid any conversation that might lead back to the events of the previous days. I had expected some kind of confrontation or emotional reaction after everything that had happened at the bank, but there was nothing like that. The silence itself felt heavier than any argument. I knew the legal process had already progressed without needing her involvement anymore. The lawyer had kept me updated in short messages, telling me that the trustee's confirmation had been officially accepted, and that the restrictions on the trust fund were now fully enforceable in my favor. That meant something very simple in legal terms, but very powerful in reality. The control over my father's trust fund was no longer in her hands. Later that morning, I received a call from the bank manager asking me to come in person. There was no urgency in his voice, only formality. But I knew what it meant. This was the moment everything would be finalized. I didn't tell my mother I was going. I simply left the house quietly and made my way to the bank alone. The atmosphere inside the bank was different from every previous visit. There was no confusion, no hesitation, no back and forth discussion. Everything had already been processed behind the scenes. I was escorted into a private office where the manager and a legal officer were waiting. They greeted me respectfully, then presented a folder containing the official confirmation of trust ownership. It was explained to me in clear terms that the original structure of the trust had been restored and validated by the trustee, and that I was now the sole beneficiary with full legal access to the assets. When I signed the final documents, my hand didn't shake, but my mind felt strangely distant. It wasn't excitement I was feeling. It was realization. A long process that had started with suspicion, then moved into investigation, and finally escalated into legal conflict, had now reached its conclusion in a quiet office with a pen and a signature. The manager asked if I wanted any financial advisory support moving forward, but I told them I needed time before making any decisions. They respected that and handed me the final file containing access details and account confirmations. As I walked out of that room, I realized that nothing in my external surroundings had changed, but everything in my internal reality had. When I stepped outside the bank, the sunlight felt normal. The street noise was unchanged, and people were going about their day as if nothing significant had happened. But for me, the world had shifted completely. I was no longer just someone waiting for an inheritance. I was now fully responsible for it. I didn't go home immediately. I sat for a long time, trying to process the fact that the trust fund my father had left for me was now entirely under my control. Everything that had been hidden, restricted, and manipulated was now legally mine without condition. But instead of feeling victorious, I felt a strange emptiness mixed with clarity. The entire struggle had been about control, trust, and truth. And now that it was resolved, there was nothing left to chase. When I eventually returned home, I found my mother inside the house. She looked at me as soon as I entered, and for the first time in a long while, there was no attempt to mask her expression. She already knew what had happened. There was no need for me to explain it. We didn't argue. There was no dramatic confrontation. The tension that had built up over months had already reached its peak and collapsed somewhere outside the house in legal documents and bank systems that neither of us were actively controlling anymore. She simply stood there for a moment, then looked away, as if accepting something she had been trying to avoid. I went to my room and placed the documents on the table. I didn't open them again. I didn't need to. Everything had already been confirmed. What stayed with me most wasn't the money or the legal outcome. It was the realization of how easily truth can be hidden behind structure, and how long it can take to uncover something that was always there but carefully controlled. I understood that the story wasn't just about a trust fund or financial control. It was about the distance between what people are told and what actually exists beneath those explanations. That night, I didn't make any plans for the future. I didn't think about what I would do next or how my life would change. I just sat in silence, aware that a chapter of my life had ended in a way I could not have predicted when I first heard that phone call months earlier. In the end, what started as suspicion turned into a fight for truth, and what felt like control slowly revealed itself as something much deeper. I didn't walk away with just a trust fund. I walked away with clarity about everything that had been hidden from me for years. Some battles don't end with victory or loss, but with understanding.